Hi there. Welcome back to Economics with Professor Ludwinski. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be having our last lesson in our unit on efficiency. And today's really about wrapping up and tying things to the real world. We'll be talking about efficiency, we'll be talking about prices, and we'll be talking about how some of this stuff applies. So we talked about other types of efficiency. What I want to do now is compare total social surplus, the one we've worked on and developed in looking at supply and demand, and see when total social surplus happens, what can we expect from these other types. So let's start with productive. If you remember, productive is a question of our businesses using their resources to their best of their ability in the production process. Now, this is not going to be a result of maximizing total social surplus. Instead, it's more an assumption that underlines the supply curve when we're thinking about things like perfect competition. So this is kind of tangential to this, but almost assumed. Now, when we think about allocative efficiency, moving goods across industries and deciding where our resources go, the total social surplus actually maps pretty well. The idea that an additional trade could increase surplus, we are doing all of these beneficial trades, so we are allocating resources to their highest valued uses. Now, the valued should be in quotation marks here because this is valued in terms of dollars, not in terms of utility or usefulness or things like that. So this maps. Pareto efficiency, the question of can we get something for free? Are there mutually beneficial transactions that aren't happening? This maps as well because the fact that we have no missing mutually beneficial trades within the market for total social surplus being maximized implies that we are being Pareto efficient. Moving on to the other three, when we think about distributive efficiency, who gets what, total social surplus assumes all dollars are valued equally, whether it's consumers or producers, poor people or rich people. It explicitly is ignoring any maximization of things in a distributive sense. And so in that way, there's really no mapping between any sort of distributive equity and total social surplus. So just because we're maximizing the surplus doesn't mean we're making things distributively efficient or equitable. In terms of dynamic efficiency, thinking across time, this is beyond the scope of total social surplus. It's really about a single time period. So it's a little bit harder to think about things intertemporally. And so there's not a clear mapping between total social surplus and dynamic efficiency. Finally, the broadest measure here, the social efficiency. This really is dependent on what are the choice of goals for society. Is your goal simply that you're Pareto efficient, or do you care somewhat about distributive efficiency, somewhat about dynamic efficiency? If you care about any of those, if they factor in at all for your society's goals, then the social efficiency will not be met with total social surplus. Necessarily. It could happen to be, but there's not a correspondence from one to the other. I want to emphasize, I said under distributive that total social surplus assumed that all those dollars are valued equally. This is a kind of hidden assumption that is happening when we do the analysis of total social surplus. If you remember, it's consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus tax revenue minus subsidies. So we are valuing, by adding these together with no modifiers, every consumer's surplus the same, every producer's surplus the same as every consumer's, revenue that goes to the government the same. All dollars are counted equally regardless of who receives it. Now, maybe you view this as a good thing. Maybe this is kind of how you see the world. A dollar is a dollar is what matters. But it's important to name your assumptions. And this is an assumption when we're talking about maximizing total social surplus and whether it's efficient. We are not taking that into consideration. And there are actually reasons to think that maybe we should. Because in this model, a surplus that gives Jeff Bezos, the owner, one of the big owners of Amazon, an extra $1,000 of profit is viewed the same as a poor single mother getting that $1,000. Or put otherwise, if we took $1,000 from the single mother and gave it to Jeff Bezos, that would be catastrophic for the single mother, and Jeff Bezos probably wouldn't even notice an extra $1,000. In terms of total social surplus, we'd say there's no change. And in fact, if Jeff Bezos got $1,001 richer and the single mother only got $1,000 poorer, total social surplus would increase. So this goes against our intuition and the economic belief that there is diminishing marginal value of dollars. As you have more money, an extra dollar is worth less. So when we're thinking about the demand curve, the preferences that lead to the demand curve, that we talk about the willingness and ability to pay, if it were the case that everyone had the same ability to pay and the same ability to express preferences, then total social surplus actually becomes more powerful. We don't have this problem with the diminishing marginal value of the dollar. And so the willingness and the ability become the same thing. Here, they really are not in terms of wealth and who has what. Just a reminder, we are kind of assuming that we have perfect markets in this framework. It is still useful even without that, but some of the things that go into that are that firms don't have market power. They're price takers. They don't have the ability to influence prices. We also assume that there's perfect information. Everybody knows everything about the products, what is available, and how they are going to benefit them. There's also no externalities, meaning there's no cost and benefits that are going to people outside of the market. We also are under the assumption that people are rational, that they're able to take this massive amount of information and turn it into good choices. We do see cases where things like the sticker price has actually a really big impact on people's behavior, not just the take-home price and take-home amount. And that's kind of a violation of depending on how you frame it, this rationality framework. Another reminder is this kind of falls apart if you add in a time component or intertemporal analysis. That being said, the world doesn't map one-to-one to our economic models, but they are still useful. And I want to emphasize one of the big useful things in the world that our model speaks to is the role and function of price. So we talked about this earlier in the course. The role and function of price is that it splits the surplus. We saw that in each of our models or each scenarios. And it determines whether the exchange happened. And we saw that when we had a difference between the price that the consumers and producers paid, that it eliminated some mutually beneficial exchanges. So price is important communication of information. Let's look at this on the consumer side. Let's say there is this very nice cheeseburger and drink that only one person can have, but there are two people that want it. Price can be the determiner. Maybe someone is kind of not that different between eating this burger and making a sandwich at home. They don't want to pay that. They will say no and go home. But this other person really enjoys cheeseburgers. And so for them, paying the price is worth it. And so this price is separating out who believes it's worth it and who believes it's not. This is the rationing function of prices. The idea that consumers will buy and consume the good at the good's price only when they value that good more highly, right? Higher than price. This means that goods flow to the people that need them the most, that want them the most, the best use. However, I want to give a caveat to this. This again is conflating ability and willingness to pay. So the willingness to pay, which is our demand curve, which determines is it worth it for this person, is not the same thing as ability to pay. Maybe this person would have benefited more, but they simply do not have the means. Right? And so we want to emphasize that with different incomes, that the highest ability to pay does not imply the best use, because we want to maybe think about utility in that instance, and not just the dollar amount they're willing to part with. So we can also think about efficiency and producers and production. So let's say we have production going on. These raw resources are being used to make stuff for consumers. They're being used to make two different goods, cars and trains. Now consumers' tastes and preferences change. Fewer are using trains. They want more cars, fewer trains, and they are expressing that with the willingness to pay more for cars and less for trains. This price expression is noticed and felt by the producer, who responds by making more cars and fewer trains. So the price, in terms of production, helps allocate resources in terms of which goods are produced. The producers are making and selling the good at that price only if the price is more than the cost of production, which includes the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost here is, are you going to give up making cars in order to make trains, right? It's not just the raw resources that are going into this. So price here for the producers is directing these raw resources, and it's moving towards what consumers want. The market is communicating consumers' demand information to producers. So to summarize what we learned, there's different ways to look at efficiency. One concept that is used in economics is total social surplus. That's the consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus tax revenue minus subsidy cost. We also saw that market interventions reduce the total amount of surplus. Now, this is assuming that the market wasn't having problems before. If a market is having an externality, for instance, it is very important to tax that market because it is already overproducing, and the tax helps bring that back. We also saw a bunch of different types of restrictions: ceilings, floors, quotas, taxes, subsidies, and we saw how those change the distribution of the surplus and who benefits. We also saw that the bigger the elasticity, the bigger the quantity response to a change with taxes and subsidies, the bigger the deadweight loss, right? The more surplus we're losing out on. For taxes and subsidies, we saw that they did not change the underlying response of the quantity supplied by producers to their take-home amount, and the quantity demanded by consumers to their total out-of-pocket cost. What is changing is the relationship of those two to transacted price. Right? So if you have a tax, your take-home amount is not the price. It's the price minus the tax. If consumers are getting the subsidy, then their total out-of-pocket cost is not the price, it's the price minus the subsidy. You're paying less than the transacted price if the consumer has a subsidy. We also looked at statutory versus economic incidents and emphasized that there's a difference between who pays a tax, who sends the money to the government, and who is ultimately impacted by a tax. This is the economic incidents. We saw that the more elastic the supply, the smaller the producer's incidence of taxation. In other words, if you have a lot of other options, then the tax is going to be less bad. Same idea for consumers. The more elastic demand, which often comes from having other options, the smaller the consumer's incidence of taxation. We also, in this last section, talked about the total social surplus, how it's useful, but it also has its limitations. It doesn't take into account the distribution, it doesn't look at the ability to pay, and it doesn't think, and it assumes perfect markets. So I hope you found this unit on efficiency and market intervention useful. I hope this helped you understand the topic. Email me if you have questions, and have a wonderful day.